Welcome to the latest installment of the Run to Daylight podcast. I'm your host, Todd Burrows, and today we will bring in Michael Dubner. And Michael will be has written a fantastic article on roster construction. I've talked a lot about how most people just consider roster construction to be how many quarterbacks, how many running backs, how many wide receivers, how many tight ends. And I try and talk a lot about putting enough weight at each position. Well, Michael has taken it a step further, and he's taken some of the work that Mike Beers used to do in the past, and he's put it together in a way far beyond anything I've seen before. There's some new things to look at. And I'm really excited to share with you guys this article that he did on RotoViz. We are going to bring up the article, and you will be able to see it yourself if you go to RotoViz. And Mike, do you have a code for them? Or
I
is it
don't have a
right on
code.
your article?
I don't have a code at the moment, but if you go right into the article, you should be able to click in and log in there.
Yeah. RotoViz has historically had the best tools for best ball, and they spend a lot of time talking about how to attack tournaments. And so I'm really excited, Michael, with this work that you've done. I'm excited that a lot of the things that I've done intuitively, partly, and also that builds upon what, I talked about Mike Beers and the work that he had done in the past, the basics of best ball. And a lot of people just want to go in and draft, and they think, oh, well, I drafted the right number of each position, I should be good. Your work clearly showed that what I've always said, which is there's a lot more to it than that, correct?
Yeah, Todd, I'm definitely excited to be here and talking best ball. And I think this is one of my favorite times of the year with fantasy football content, especially because I think studying macro concepts and not just these micro player takes is one of my favorite things to analyze. And really, when it comes down to macro concepts with best ball roster construction, especially as the field gets better and starts to implement these positional limits on a more regular basis, we have to get more specific with how we should be allocating draft picks within the specific positional limits. And part of that is this idea of quantity versus quality at a given position. And that's definitely what this article gets into, not just drafting 2 to 3 quarterbacks, but which rounds should we be drafting those quarterbacks in? And can we see any year over year trends in that regard?
And speaking of best ball, you will find me in the lobby of a lot of FFPC drafts. I love the fact that the FFPC is tight end premium and that there's only 2 wide receivers instead of 3 with most and 2 flexes. So 2 wide receivers instead of 3 really gives you a lot of different ways to build and a lot of different ways to get where you're going right now. The FFPC is doing the early best ball tournament. I just signed up for another one, and I plan on doing about 30 between myself and partners. And you can, they're $120 with $25,000 up top. One of the things I love the most is the fact that you don't have to build a 1 or 2% build to get to the finals. 17% of teams make it to the playoffs, and then each week for 3 weeks, 25% of teams advance. So again, I think that the kind of stuff we're going to talk about today with Michael applies to this even more. But we will cover with Michael also how to aim for that 1 or 2% outcome as well. Go to myffpc.com. And if you sign up for your first ever contest, use the code BESTBALL and save $25. Michael, welcome back.
It's good to be back on. This is one of my off-season podcasts I definitely listened to and have been on before. So it's good to be back and talking best ball.
Yeah, I got to the final 12 in the FFPC last year. I had good leverage for the final week, and of course, the leverage wasn't what went off. It was more chalk with Burrow and Chase. But that's, all you can do is put yourself in position to win. I regret nothing. I had Joe Mixon. I was the only one of 12 people who had Mixon in the finals. 11 of 12 teams that made it to the finals had Mark Andrews. I was the only team that had Hollywood Brown as well. And those were great leverage plays, but they just didn't work out.
Yeah, definitely just being in that final week and having a shot at the grand prize is exciting.
It was
even
so
if it doesn't
exciting.
end up working
It really
out.
was. It makes it all worthwhile. So I want to bring up your article, and you can go to rotoviz.com, and let's get this so that people can see it a little bit more. All right, we'll leave us. Can you see that pretty good, Michael?
Yeah, I can see it fine.
All right. So what I want to do is Michael starts with the quarterback construction, and then he works his way down position by position. But I want to start at running back. And the reason I want to start at running back is, in my opinion, Michael, that's really the biggest decision you have to make when you start a draft. Would you agree, as far as what your strategy is going to be for that draft? Everything seems to jump off from what you're going to do with running back. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a really good point. I think that ultimately what you do at running back kind of dictates how you play the other positions. And of course, between quarterback and tight end, they're onesie positions, but between running back and receiver, really how you play running back will dictate how you play receiver then as well. So I think your draft strategy really comes down to your running back strategy.
Right. So we're going to hit that first. We're only going to do running back and quarterback because there's so much to hit here. We're going to do running back and quarterback in this podcast, and Michael will come back and join me sometime in the near future, and we will hit wide receiver and tight end. We will also, we want to have a caveat here that this information is from the Best Ball 10s, which are formerly the MFL 10s. And while the format isn't quite as popular as it used to be, with a full PPR and 3 starting wide receivers and 1 flex, it does go back further than any other site. So as we go along, we have a longer period by Michael using BB10. And then as we go through each one, we will discuss how this may or may not change for half PPR, which is underdog, and which what I laid out before, which is the FFPC tight end premium, where you have the extra flex position. All right. So the first thing we're looking at here is you can see balanced running back roster constructions. All right. So, Michael, do you want to explain the difference between a balanced construction and an extreme construction?
Yeah, I think that ultimately what it comes down to is most of the time people at running back talk about the extreme constructions like zero running back, anchor running back, where you're either taking a few running backs early and then loading up kind of later with your zero running back targets, or with the other extreme options is you could be loading up on running back early, but then stopping late. But while most people talk about the extreme constructions, most people actually draft balanced, whether it be drafting 2 running backs early or 3 running backs early. And so I tried to separate these two out between the balanced approaches or the extreme approaches. Within the balanced approach, you can have 2 running backs early within the first 5 rounds or 3 running backs early. And I kind of separate them out ultimately between having an anchor running back early within the first 2 rounds versus if you have your running backs in rounds 3 through 5, which is traditionally more of the dead zone. And so ultimately I wanted to see how these different approaches compare to one another. And we look at both win rates as well as top 2 percentile rates, which is more of your ceiling outcomes, and then also see how the field has been utilizing these rates in terms of ownership percentages and how they've changed through the years.
Yep. So if we were to look at 2021 utilization, that would mean 45.3% of teams in Best Ball 10s use this 2 running back early philosophy, and 3 running backs would be 29.1. Together, that's 74.4%. Am I getting that correct? That you would add those two together, and between that 74% of rosters had one or the other form of balanced running back construction.
That's right. Ultimately, an overwhelming majority of the field does some type of balanced construction with drafting either 2 or 3 running backs early.
All right. What right. So
I
two
think
running backs
ultimately,
obviously is huge here.
yeah.
And there's an obvious takeaway here when you're looking at these numbers as well, correct?
Yeah, ultimately, just from this kind of, I would say this is more, more of a generalization. It's not very specific, but we see here early on that 2 running back early clearly is better than 3 running back early, with 2 running back early having an 8.8% win rate, which is a positive over, if baseline's 8.3% 1 in 12 teams, 2 running back early does provide a positive expectation, but then 3 running back early comparatively is actually negative baseline with 7.2%. But what we really want to see is if you scroll down a little bit to more of the specific constructions within the balance build.
We'll get to that in a sec.
Yeah.
I just want to make one other point about this is like Michael said, it's general. Like right now, I just did a draft where I took Aaron Jones at 4-2 as my 3rd running back. And the reason for that is normally I don't like taking 3 early, but I really feel like Aaron Jones has fallen too far, and he was the best value on the board. So 2 things happen there. One, if I'm going to take a 3rd early, I'm going to balance it by not having a 4th running back till the double-digit rounds. Okay? Or if I take a 4th in the single-digit rounds, I'm not going to take a 5th running back. Michael, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think ultimately when we're looking at roster construction builds from these macro lenses, we have to understand that within a specific draft, ultimately individual players make up these constructions, and you have to be willing to, bend roster construction rules for your specific draft. And if that might mean that a running back falls a lot further than expected, he might have a higher value, and you can deviate from your roster construction a little bit, but then you might have to make up for it in other ways. And it's kind of this balanced approach between quality and quantity, and just understanding if you're drafting earlier, you might have to take fewer later.
And it's almost like an elevator, right? The old-fashioned elevators, it was, if the elevator goes down, the weight goes up, right? And if the weight goes down, the elevator goes up. So it's the same way. If you're going to weight your running back room heavier early, it means you do need to adjust the weight that you put. I see too many people do it, and this could be a big, the one thing this won't show us is how badly people did each formula. In other words, I look at tons of drafts where people will take 3 running backs early, Michael, and then they'll still take 5 with and they'll end up being really weak at a couple other positions. That's why these the 3 running backs or any of the, in other words, all these can win, but what we're looking at is what the average is. But if you use a weighted philosophy, you can win with anything, correct?
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And ultimately, if you're getting what I would consider to be ADP closing line value on a player, it's certainly an opportunity where your micro take might outweigh your macro roster construction, and you just have to deviate and correct later in the rounds.
Yep. So we're going to go to the other thing that you were talking about. So think of that as kind of like an entry way into discussing running backs, where this is the most important screen. So Michael has broken down 2 running backs early by 3 different by these different terms. Michael, explain what double anchor, anchor plus one, and two running back upside down is.
Yeah, like you mentioned, when we're just discussing 2 RB early versus 3 RB early, that certainly that's better than nothing, but we have to get more specific. And these are more of the specific roster constructions because we know that if you're going 2 running back early, it's very different if you go running back, and then rounds 3, 4, 5, you're taking other positions versus if you're taking running backs in rounds 4 to 5 and not taking one in rounds 1 to 3. So this is trying to break that out a little bit. And essentially, the word anchor in this description means you're taking a running back in rounds 1 or 2. That's your anchor running back. And all the upside down would
And
mean
if they get hurt, the anchor sinks you.
right. And so upside down in this case means your running back is early. It's still going within the first 5 rounds, but it's going in the second half of that. You're taking the running back in rounds 3 through 5. So if you're going double anchor RB, that means you're taking 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, and then you're not taking a running back until after round 5. But that's very different from 2 RB early, where your 2 running backs are upside down, where you're not taking a running back until round 3, and you're taking 2 in rounds 3 through 5. And those have very different win rates, as you'll see here in a moment.
Right. And then there's obviously the same kind of breakdown for 3 running backs. A 3-peat, an anchor plus 2, and 3 RB upside down.
Right. And I think they're along with like how you actually read the charts, I think you can either go chart by chart and compare each roster construction to one another. The other way you can read the chart is kind of going vertically. So you isolate one roster construction, you look at the win rate of that construction, then the top 2 percentile rate, then the field utilization rate, and then you go horizontally. So there's a couple of different ways you can really break down these constructions.
Yep. And when you look at double anchor, it has much more variance to it than anchor plus 1, right? I think I know why that is, but why don't you cover it?
No, I think that ultimately what we're seeing here is that double anchor RB has been historically a very good strategy. In about, it looks like 4 or 5 years, it had positive win rates. It's really only in 2020 where it struggled. And you compare that to, say, anchor plus 1, which has had a lower ceiling. And, the win rates, it's only had 1 or 2 slightly negative win rates, but it doesn't have quite the ceiling of double anchor running back. And I think ultimately it comes down to, how many running backs are you probably selecting after that as well. I think there's a couple of ways to explain that, but really the big trend with these balance builds early that we're seeing here is that the more running backs you select in the running back dead zone, the worse your win rates. So double anchor RB has 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, but 0 in the dead zones from 3 to 5. Compare that to, say, anchor plus 1, where you have 1 running back early and then 1 running back in the dead zone, and then you have worse win rates. And then compare that to, say, 2 running back early upside down, where both of your running backs are in the dead zone and the win rates start to drop dramatically. And then you can see the same exact trend in the 3 running back early builds as well.
Correct. And a new guest, Sir Scheib, says was a good year for the Eckler-Taylor double anchor. Well, at times, that's Sheba, Sir Sheba. Sorry. So if you want to check out my last episode, I talked about the effect of injuries on first and second round players and how nothing that you can do compare to what happened. Nothing you could project can come close to what happens when a first or second round pick gets hurt. And then I also have talked about supercharging in the past, because 2 years ago, Barkley had a 2% win rate as the second pick. Well, a running back who got hurt last year had more like a 8% advance rate. The difference being both when they are selected, but also who's coming back. When if typically when you draft second, you have people 23rd to 25th that you're stacking that number 2 with. If they don't have a good year, or one of them gets hurt along with an injury at the number 2 spot, you're going to get like a 2% advance rate out of Barkley, where Eckler and Taylor, at times, you could take both of them. Eckler had a 30% advance rate this year, and Taylor had a 48%. And what they do is they supercharge each other. But this is different. What Michael is talking about is taking that into consideration here. Correct, Michael? It's
Yeah,
an
I think
overall look rather than
that's
it's a
similar.
macro look rather than a micro look.
Yeah, rather than looking at two players correlating with one another based off your draft position, we're looking at how positions can correlate with one another. For example, if you're taking double anchor running back and then you're not drafting a running back in rounds 3 through 5, well, that might mean that you were able to, which we'll see later, you might have gotten the elite tight end that helped with your roster construction, or you were drafting wide receivers in that wide receiver sweet spot between rounds 3 through 6. So not only are you avoiding the dead zone running backs, but then you're also drafting the other positions at their optimal draft rounds as well.
And what the biggest takeaway to me here of what we're discussing is both double anchor and anchor plus one are very viable historically, but upside down is just not a good strategy.
Yeah, because even if you find yourself, say there's one running back in the dead zone that you really like that year, it's fine to take him. It's fine to do the anchor plus one. It becomes a real issue when you think you can keep doing that over and over again, and you think there's multiple values in the dead zone, because ultimately we've seen that area of the draft is just a very fragile area for running backs. So sure, there might be one or two values that you can pinpoint, but you shouldn't be targeting that area of the draft as a whole for running backs.
Yeah. And I think the best time to target the dead zone is now, right? Because what happens? We know who are the guy, because eventually opportunity, we all know that opportunity is the main thing that gives running backs value, correct? Well, right now, anybody who has a locked in opportunity and is talented in any way is going in the first 2 rounds. So what do you find in the dead zone? You find guys who are rookies, who we don't know where they're going to land yet. And we find players who are more fragile, that if a team adds someone in free agency or the draft, they are going to drop. So right now they're in the dead zone, but within, starting in May, we're going to have a lot more clarity, and you're going to see some of these dead zone running backs end up in the top 3 rounds, and you're going to see some of the dead zone running backs drop past the dead zone. But then the phenomenon happens every year is that people want running backs in that dead zone. So someone who should be a 7th to 9th round guy is still in the dead zone. And that's how I see it, Michael. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think right now is, to summarize, kind of the most volatile situation for running backs. We can either see them jump up multiple rounds, or we can see their value really crater. And so you just have to understand that variance with the running backs you're selecting. And ultimately, we want to avoid, I would say, the bad running backs in the dead zone that are only being drafted there because of what we perceive to be secure volume. But ultimately, we know that if they lose that job, they will then crater in value. We want to select the young running backs who have a lot of potential still, who might not have immediate volume, but if they perform well, we see it really shoot up. Someone like Jamal Williams last year, or someone like that.
Yeah, I think that is a very, very fair prize. I just said prize because I changed the logo. Our friends at the FFPC have $1 million grand prize for the first time ever in the main event. $5.9 million prize pool. The main event, one of the premier, if not the premier, high stakes contest in the land. Let's move on to are there any takeaways in this takeaway section, Michael, that we haven't hit on so far?
I think the biggest takeaway that we did hit on is just you want to avoid running backs in the dead zone from a macro lens. Of course, there's always specific examples that you might want to personally target, but as a whole, you should be avoiding that range for running backs in rounds 3 through 5.
Check out my podcast on exposure and how to blend exposure to build on the point that Michael just made. It's not about when I think the term fading, Michael, people misunderstand and they take fading to mean you don't take any. When fading from a true DFS perspective means underweight.
Yeah, and I think especially as you get into a higher volume of drafts, even if you are underweight a player and you're quote unquote fading them, I think that the time to really get your exposure is when they are being drafted after that ADP. So at least if you don't like a player, you're still getting that ADP closing line value on the player. I think that's probably the best way to balance your portfolio for the players that you want to be underweight on.
And that's exactly what I do. Playing ADP is one of the big advantages. You might not, people get too dogmatic, Michael. I don't like this guy. Okay, well, you don't like him. I don't like him in the 5th round. Okay, well, when would you like him? Well, I would like him in the 7th round. Well, he's never getting to the 7th round. You're going to have 0. One of my core philosophies this year is I'm not as smart as I think I am. I know that's hard for most people to get, but picking players is perilous. Every year we get some right, we get some wrong. So if a guy is not going to make it to the 7th round and you don't think he's worth the 5th round, well, it would make sense to take a couple of that player in the 6th round just to hedge your bets. That's my philosophy, Michael.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I know we're not going over it today, but I actually put out a free best ball roster tracker that you can find and use for yourself on my Twitter account. And one of the metrics it does track is ADP closing line value, as well as your player exposures. So you may see that you have, say, you're underweight 5% a player, but if you see that he's going after he's currently available after his ADP, well, maybe that's a good point to draft him. So I think that if you're going to be underweight a player, one of the things that you can do is get positive closing line value on the ADP when you do get exposure.
I agree. And let's move on to extreme roster constructions with running backs. You make before we even go anywhere, and I'm as guilty as anyone at taking shots at the 0 running back guys because they kind of make it a religion. And I don't mean any one specific person or website, just to be very clear. But in general, 0 running back is talked about as if it's a strategy that is used 30-40% of the time. My research, that's the case, at least in non-tournament best ball.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, the first thing that was most surprising to me about the extreme running back constructions is just how infrequently they are actually used compared to how much people really argue about them. If you scroll it down a little bit, you can see the field utilization rates, and they are almost all sub 10%. Some of them sub 2% of the field are actually using these constructions with the way that they're written in terms of round cutoffs.
Correct. All right. So in here we've got 0 running back, which is one you define as 1 running back after round 5. And we could do a whole show on how some people think they're doing 0 running back. And this is back to my point about you can you can call it a strategy and still do it wrong. But we won't get into that too deeply. 0 running back, 1 running back after round 5. Anchor running back is 1 running back in round 1 to 2. Running back 2 after round 5. Hyper fragile, which is running back 3 by round 5, maximum of 4, and robust running back, which is 4 running backs by round 5. What's your number one takeaway here, Michael?
I think ultimately it's a similar takeaway to what we saw in the balance builds. Is just how much you want to avoid the running back dead zone. And really just emphasizing the importance also of at running back, you really want either quality of running back, meaning hyper fragile, or because you're taking running backs early, which is quality running backs, or you want quantity of running backs, meaning say 0 running back, where you're not taking a running back early, but then you're taking a lot late, but you don't want both. You don't want to do robust running back where you take both quality and quantity at running back. You either want to bet on your studs really performing like studs, such as hyperfragile RB, or you want to bet on your 0 running back targets to really break out and carry your roster like 0 running back. But you
Yeah.
don't want to bet on both.
And you are using win rates here. Let's be clear. Win rates are half of advance rates approximately. Win rate means you win 1 of 12, which is, historically when you do a best ball 10, 90% of the money is for first place. In tournaments, the top 2 advance. So if anyone has any question why these numbers are lower than advance rates, that's why. And then Michael, what he does very effectively here is he talks about win rates, and then he talks about top 2% rate. Michael, what did your research show? Both with the win/advance rates and the top 2 percentile rate.
I think the main takeaway really is when everyone keeps saying something like, this is a good strategy for a traditional league, but not a good strategy for a tournament. I don't necessarily buy that, because I think that strategies that are good for a traditional best ball league where you're winning, say, 1 out of 12, I think we see a high correlation between win rates and top 2 percentile rates. So I think ultimately a strategy that works in a traditional best ball league is probably a good strategy in a tournament. Of course, there might be a few exceptions, but I think by and large, strategies that will win a league are also correlated to high ceilings as well.
And the one thing that I find, and this goes obviously on underdog, where you actually do need kind of a 1 or 2% outcome to win a tournament, when you're going to face off in the final week against anywhere from 80 to 160 other teams, versus what I mentioned in the FFPC, where 25% of teams a week advance. But you definitely see, and I know you won't see this with your, but just from my eyeball test, people are doing extreme strategies a lot more in tournaments, trying to get that magic bullet. But let's look at the extreme construction, the utilization rate for each one of these in standard best ball, and then talk to us about at what point do you think it's too much?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway here is that ultimately people by and large are drafting balanced early much more frequently than they're drafting extreme. I think that this data is maybe a little bit skewed because we're looking at best ball 10s, and we're not looking at, say, underdog tournaments, especially not only because it's a tournament format, but I think underdog drafters have been drafting with, they're consuming more content. They're probably drafting, more based off Rotoviz or Establish the Run or whatever you name it type of strategies that have been putting out these extreme content, extreme strategies. So I think that those rates are probably higher. And that's the one thing I really want to look at if I get access to that data. I think another thing that's important, what you were mentioning between the different formats, not only, I think that there might be a small difference between tournaments and traditional leagues, but I think when you're talking about how this data with best ball 10 might relate to, say, underdog or FPC, I think it's important to recognize that these conclusions are probably directionally accurate across all formats, whether using full PPR, half PPR, or 18 rounds versus 20 rounds. I think ultimately, we don't need to be so precise with our win rate analysis, but we just need to be directionally accurate. So I think no matter what format you're using, these principles still apply across best ball formats.
Yeah. And I could have sworn last year, because I did this with a number of drafts, and I would estimate that 3 to 4 drafts, and sometimes more, in every out of 12, and almost every tournament I did had an extreme build. And not only did it have an extreme build, but they didn't build them correctly a lot of the time, which was a huge advantage to me in my strategy of just building solid. Let's see.
And I think that from these extreme builds, the biggest takeaway is just how dominant anchor RB really is year over year. And that's because you're getting the one running back that's going to carry your team, hopefully be the stud, like say you're Jonathan Taylor, or even just a running back that will be in your starting lineup every week. And then after that, you just need to fill your running back 2 position, especially in the formats that only have 2 running back starters and then 3 receivers with 1 flex. You really want that running back 1 anchor, and then after that you can just piece together your running back 2. And that's really a dominant strategy year over year. And of course, it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to win a tournament because you want anchor RB or that the other strategies won't work. It's just that anchor running back, you can bank on that being a successful strategy every year. If you look at the top 2 percentile rates, it's been above 2% every year since 2017.
Yeah, and I love that. And that was my dominant strategy for most of last year. And I did mix it in, depending on, again, what I was finding on the draft boards. Another real big advantage in best ball, I believe, is knowing where the peaks and valleys are. Like right now, to me, being able to get guys like Rashad Penny, James Conner, Miles Sanders, Ramondre Stevenson, Damian Harris in rounds 8 to 10 means that, if I take 2 running backs early and I take my third in that range, I've got really good upside with a really good floor. And then I could take whoever else I want to fill that out. So would you agree so my point is that which one of these ideal strategies I'm going to use changes based on where the overall ADP values are on the board at the time, but also what I'm finding in any individual draft.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also, one thing that these macro strategies we can't really see with, say, looking at zero running back or anchor running back is then how do you fill in those running backs? Are you taking running backs that are more traditionally handcuffs, like, say, Alexander Madison, who is going to perform if Cook gets hurt, but if he doesn't get hurt, he's not going to do much? Or are you going to take, more of a running back 2B who he's going to get some work every week, put up some points, but he might not have the, say, maybe there's a third running back behind him where he's still going to be in the committee, even if the starter gets hurt. So I think what type of archetypes you take within these strategies also matter. And that's where you're looking at the individual players and their ADP to see which strategy will work for you.
Correct. And that is a core philosophy of mine. It's how you blend, right? We all know that a guy like Madison can be great if you don't have Cook and Cook gets hurt. Now you have your regular running backs plus Madison. But you also, one of my big things that I think people underestimate is the value of floor. And there's 2 ways you can get floor. Like one would be obviously, and there's been a lot of studies on this that they're underappreciated, is third down type backs, right? You get that guy who almost every week is going to catch 3 to 5 passes, without scoring a touchdown or getting a carry. Has a very good shot of getting you 10 points. I think people underestimate the value of that guy. And I think they also underestimate the value of a guy like Jamal Williams this year, who I wasn't on last year in round 10 to 12, but I'm getting in round 17 to 19. He's if it works out to be a 2/3, 1/3 thing with him and Swift, that 1/3 is another way to get to that magic 10 points, which to me is when a running back becomes having a usable week. So I think building floor, I think people underestimate the value of floor late trying to hit home runs.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. I think it was Jack Miller last year on ETR wrote a really good article about the pass catching running backs and how valuable they really are for your best ball rosters. Ben Gretsch has also talked about how these running backs that catch passes, we traditionally think of them as floor guys without a ceiling, but he's actually talked about, which I agree with. These running backs actually they do have they actually do have more of a ceiling than people realize because they can string together these passes in a game that dictates a pass happy game script. So I think that they have more of a ceiling than people realize. And the other thing to note about this is you have to be really price sensitive with these pass catching running backs. For example, I think it was 2 years ago when Nyheim Hines was going in maybe around 18 plus. He was a really good value that year. I had a lot of him 2 years ago. But then last year, after a good year, Nyheim Hines was going in like the 10th round. And at that point, I'm out on him at that ADP. So I think you want to catch these guys the year before they break out, not the year after they break out.
That's a fair point, even though I had a lot of Hines last year. It didn't work out, but that was because something we didn't expect happened, which is he lost part of his role. But the other thing I'm always looking for, Michael, is, I talk about injury, and it's the most important thing to consider when you're drafting best ball. What happens to that third down back if there's an injury, right? What is the chance that maybe he's not an every down back, but if he's a guy who gets 2 to 3 carries a game, if there's an injury, do we legitimately think that he's now going to be an 8 to 10 carry guy who is, quote, the starter, and they spell him, and now he's going to get also, instead of 3 to 5 targets a week, maybe 5 to 8 targets a week? Or is he a third down back that if there's an injury, he's just going to continue in the role that he has? I think we always want to put people on our rosters who have a chance with injury to inherit a sizable workload.
Right. Is he going to be James White, where pretty much no matter what, he's going to max out at, say, 5 carries and still continue in his receiving role where he'll get, say, 5 targets? Or is he Tony Pollard, where if he's going to get his, couple of carries and targets and be a valuable asset even as a backup, but then if Zeke gets hurt, Tony Pollard is an RB1. You want the guy who has that contingency upside.
Jose Pena has a question. Isn't extreme running back strategy a low expected value to win in best ball?
Well, I think that, we're looking at the extreme running backs right now. I think it depends on which type of extreme running back are we talking about. Are you talking about extreme early, such as robust RB? I mean, that's a very low expected value. But if you go extreme in the other way, with zero running back, anchor running back, hyper fragile running back, we see it's a very high expected win rate. Zero running back and anchor running back near 10 to 11% win rates year over year. Hyper fragile running back, maybe not as high of win rates, but very high top 2 percentile ceiling rates. So really with running back, in the extremes, you either want extreme quantity where you want extreme quality, but you don't want both. And so I think that the key is pointing out that you don't want both quantity and quality when you're extreme. You want one or the other.
Yeah, and we always have to also consider that what worked last year is going to be owned more the following year. And anchor running back was very considered to be the most effective way to go last year. So I'm seeing a lot more anchor and a lot less extreme. See, I don't think anchor running back is an extreme strategy, but I'm seeing a lot less zero and hyper fragile and robust early this year. And I think it's because anchor was so successful. And what we have to understand is that when a strategy becomes, and this is just in general with all of Michael's work, this stuff is only as good as the ADP it was formed from. So if the utilization of anchor goes up 15 or 20%, what that does is it makes it harder to be successful with it, and B, it tends to create value because people are ignoring that second running back, right? If everyone's doing anchor, that means you're, like right now, a perfect example is early to mid third round. Early to mid third round, I'm finding Gibson and Barkley at times. And to me, those are guys, and because people are going anchor, I think that is causing a change. Talk a little bit about that and what you personally are trying to be aware of and how it relates to your work.
Yeah, I think that Sean Siegel and Ben Gretsch on the Stealing Bananas podcast have talked about this a little bit, and I really do agree in that the dead zone, this might be the first year where I see it really possibly changing, because now that people are catching on to the idea of the dead zone, I see sometimes running backs at the top of drafts are going earlier than ever, and then running backs within the dead zone are actually being pushed down later than before, and it's because they're using these strict draft round guidelines where you hear don't draft a running back in the dead zone. They're literally not taking a running back in rounds. People are now not taking a running back in rounds 3 through 5, no matter what. They're ignoring the player value. They're only going based off this strict round cutoff. But this is now creating a value because running backs that used to go early third round are actually falling because people don't want to, they're trying to stick to this strict rule rather than being, blending their strategies and taking the draft room, based off the value. So I think as these ADPs change, so do our strategies. And I'm interested to see how the dead zone shakes out this year because of that.
Correct. And what we need to consider is a player's opportunity at the running back position. What makes the dead zone to me, the dead zone, is that people tend to assume opportunity. And the perfect example of that last year was Mike Davis. Well, he's the only guy that's there, right? That can, that tends to backfire on you more often than it doesn't.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think that the running backs, if you're going to take someone in the dead zone, the ones that you really want to target are the running backs that have not broken out yet. You don't want to take the running backs that are old or, these Mike Davises. You want to take the running backs where you haven't seen it yet and they're being priced down because of that uncertainty.
Yes. And if a running back is a jag, just a guy, it's real easy for them to be replaced by just another guy. And I wanted to warn about that because I do think that's something that we run into. That to me tends to be a true dead zone running back. To me, is a guy who everyone is like Myles Gaskin last year. Everyone assumes has a role that he might not actually have, right? But a guy like Travis Etienne, who right now is in the dead zone, if they don't take another back, I mean, he is a guy who has high draft capital and talent. I mean, he's a guy who I'm certainly willing to take in the dead zone.
Yeah, I think ETN is kind of the perfect running back dead zone to actually draft because he's being priced down because uncertainty, whether it be injury or role, but we know he has the talent. He was he was drafted in the first round and he's a pass catching running back. So he has all the upside in the world. He's just being priced down because of uncertainty in his role. And that's the player that you could see being a first round pick next year because of talent if he's given the opportunity. And so he has a high floor, high ceiling at that draft pick.
Correct. All right. So I think we've covered this really well. All across the utilization, though, you can see here that can you see my thing moving?
Yeah, we can see your cursor.
Okay. Don't cursor at me. Yeah. So this is the big advantage to these strategies because you can see they're all orange and red, where over here you're seeing some green. But as these strategies get used more and more, you really have to be careful because that's when I start doing less of a strategy.
I think that there's a really fun chart right here that you're about to get to, and it really does show how you want to either draft quality or quantity at the running back position. Once when you bet on your early round running back with anchor RB, you can see the more running backs you add early as you go across to double anchor or 3 early or robust RB, your win rates start to drop. So you really at running back, you just want to bet on the one guy that's going to carry your roster. And then after that, piece it together for your running back too.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a team that I was building with Shane Hallam. Give me a second. I'll pull it up. That's not it. Give me one more second, okay?
And also, while you're pulling this up, or later in the article, we see, I think it's interesting that if you take the strategy of choosing or using both zero running back and hyper fragile running back, which are both essentially strategies betting on the opposite outcomes of whether it be quality or quantity of running back winning that year. With zero running back, you want the early running backs to get early and you're drafting quantity, while hyper fragile running back, you're drafting the quality and then missing out later. If you were to take the top 2 percentile rates for the past 5 years, you would have 3.3%, 5.1%, 3.1%, 3.2%, 2.4%. So if you just kind of alternate between hyper fragile and zero running back in a given year, you would have very high win rates, which I think is interesting.
All right, so evaluate this. We're team 6, so we took Derrick Henry with the first pick. And then you can see that we went Singletary in the 8th, Damian Harris in the 9th, Rashad White in the 12th, Donta Foreman in the 17th, and Myles Gaskin in the 18th. So we went heavy, and let's see, is there any? Yeah, and that's it. So we ended up going with 6, but we had the anchor, and then we added Singletary, Harris, both guys who should be locked in with pretty decent floors. But you need to, we're not sure they're going to have a ceiling yet, but they have an opportunity for a ceiling. Rashad White, a rookie, that's more of a Shane pick than me. I like Foreman. And then I threw in, this was my suggestion, Gaskin, a guy who has some third down chops and is now 18th round. Your thoughts on this running back room?
Yeah, I think that wasn't. I honestly haven't done that many 2022 drafts. I take it kind of slow in the offseason. That's just my style while I'm still analyzing the prior years. But from a macro sense, you do the anchor running back, which we know has a very successful win rate of about 11%. So just macro strategy, it's already off to a good start. You get the early tight end, which we know, which we haven't discussed yet, but elite tight end is a very successful strategy. And then you're kind of hammering receivers in the rounds 4 through 12 range of your draft, which is also successful. So I think overall you do, specifically with running back, you get your anchor running back, and then you don't take too many early, but then you still have guys that can kind of fill out that running back too.
Right. And again, back to that 8th, 9th round value that I'm seeing, right? Kenneth Walker, Singletary normally goes a round or two earlier. So that was more of a pick that I haven't taken him. So I took him at value. Kareem Hunt's in here. Sanders is in here. Ramondre's in here. Penny is not too far away. Dylan. So these are all guys that you can hit. So fantasy data, which I believe is probably still my friend Billy Musio. What is Michael's opinion on Superflex, and how does that alter his research?
Yeah, I think Superflex is kind of a whole new beast, and you really need to analyze that separately compared to one quarterback leagues. Actually, RotoViz with the FFPC roster construction explorer, it does have a Superflex filter, so you can do all of this research and apply it to Superflex as well. So I haven't personally dug into Superflex that much. I've done a couple of the underdog drafts just for fun. I think ultimately you really do want to prioritize those quarterbacks because that will, it's just otherwise you won't get any points at that spot. But I haven't dug into Superflex too much, so I can't give too much of an opinion.
All right. So you put in hyperfragile is another, and the simple answer to robust running back is just don't do it.
I had to throw that in there.
I think it's true. I think that, and what's funny is when I first started back, I think it was 15 or 16, that was the predominant strategy for best ball 10s.
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed a lot through the years, and that's why it's so important to not only filter by, say, 2017 to 2021, but you really need to break it out by year and year, and also see how the field utilization trends change. Because as utilization trends change, the success rates of these roster constructions might change, which you've been mentioning throughout as well.
All right, let's move over to your work at quarterback. Much simpler than running back, right? There's two quarterbacks in the window, three quarterbacks in the window, elite quarterback, and latent three. Why don't you explain just what each one of these is?
Yeah, I think, with quarterback and tight end at the onesie positions, it's definitely much simpler just because not only is it the nature of drafting less players at that position, but there seems to be these specific pockets. And the quarterback in window is really from Sean Siegel's work. I think it was in 2019 where he found the quarterback window. The optimal times to draft a quarterback tends to be in rounds 6 through 12. And so you can either draft two quarterbacks in the window, three quarterbacks in the window. But then I also look at two of the more popular constructions as well, being elite quarterback when you're drafting a quarterback, your first quarterback by round 5, or if you're drafting, if you're not drafting that quality quarterback in the early rounds, what if you draft 3 late with late and 3 as well, which is when you draft your first quarterback in the double digit rounds.
You still there?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, sorry, I ran out for a sec. I was hoping you would talk until I
No
until I
worries.
got back. All right, so we know the different kinds of. I was parched and I had run out of water. So this is very much in line with the early strategy that I had been taught, which is, to be clear, from the old days, the numbers showed that as long as you got two quarterbacks in the top, you know, 8 to 15, that was the best strategy. Is that what we're still seeing here?
Yeah, that's right. I think especially, in the old days when quarterback streaming started to become really popular and people learned that in redraft, you can just stream your quarterback off free agency. But what Sean Siegel ended up showing is that you actually, in best ball, it's a whole different animal. You really need two quality quarterbacks. He found that before 21 at least, you don't want the elite guy because they're just being drafted too early. It's too high of an opportunity cost. But you still want two quality quarterbacks because you don't have access to the waiver wire, because you are able to get the best score from between the two quarterbacks. You don't want the late round quarterbacks because they either lack the ceiling, which is what you need in best ball, or they lack job security, which is obviously a huge issue in best ball if your starter gets benched. So what he ended up finding is that you really do want 2 to 3 quality quarterbacks, but you don't want to draft them too early, and then you don't want to draft them too late either. You just want that perfect window between round 6 through 12.
Yeah, and I do think if you look at what won last year, Joe Burrow was the perfect example of that kind of quarterback. I'm not against taking a Mahomes or a Josh Allen when they drop, or if I'm stacking. But if I take one of those guys, very similar to my tight end strategy, if I do take one of those guys, I still want a good second one within the window, but uh, I um, I want the end of the window rather than the beginning of the window. Where if I'm taking my first one in the middle to end of the window, I want to immediately come back and hit a second one. Last year, my best team on Underdog, it wasn't in the tournament, but it was drafted against a bunch of 1 week season people. It had Stafford and Brady, and that's typically the range that I like to have the most uh, quarterbacks in. The guys who are in that tier of the better quarterbacks, but they're in the back end of the tier.
Right, I completely agree. If you take a guy early, you still want your second quarterback in the window, but it might be towards the end of the window. Well, you know how we've been talking about this balance between quality and quantity. Well, with quarterback, you want to balance that quality and quality, but not across 20 rounds. You want to balance it across the window.
Correct. And talk about late quarterback. Um, three quarterbacks late. I actually got my team to the final with that. But what's funny about that is out of 130 teams, I think I only had like three or four teams with that construction. I just kind of hit the nuts at the other positions. And I had Carson Wentz, Ryan Fitzpatrick, and Ben Roethlisberger. And that was my team that went to the finals. And boy, I was hating life, because that last week, when you have to come in first, you don't want that. But the numbers in general are really bad for that strategy. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, as we see here, if you're talking about tournaments with a ceiling, so we're talking about the top 2 percentile rates, it has a 0.8 top 2 percentile rate, which is really bad for the three quarterbacks late. But it doesn't mean that's impossible. I mean, still, it makes up 0.8% of the 2%. So it's still possible. It's just not, over a long term approach, it's not as successful as just drafting your quarterbacks in the window.
And we also see the three QBs in the window can work.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that three quarterbacks in window actually has a slightly higher win rate than two quarterbacks in their window, but then two quarterbacks in the window has a higher ceiling rate. So I think that's, an important distinction, and kind of speaks to how in tournaments you might want to get more fragile with your rosters with only grabbing two quarterbacks, hoping that they're the ones that hit and that the third quarterback isn't going to be contributing as much.
Yeah, and most of my drafts this year, even with 20 rounds, have been two quarterbacks in the window. Kind of Justin Fields is kind of my, the last of that kind of tier for me.
Yeah, and I think as we begin to transition to talking about elite quarterback, I think this is probably the most interesting quarterback strategy to talk about, because elite quarterbacks, they were historically very bad because they didn't actually have a tangible ceiling to separate from the other quarterbacks being drafted comparatively in the quarterback window. But I think it's also now we're seeing this quarterback resurgence. So we had, if you consider it to be kind of the dark ages of the elite quarterback around 2017 to 2020, and now in 2021, we kind of see this resurgence of the elite quarterback because if you look at the win rates, the elite quarterback, it wasn't as bad as it was before, but if you actually only took if you took an elite quarterback and then stopped at two, you had a pretty good win rate of about 9.5%, I believe. So it's interesting to see if 2021 will continue as as a resurgence of the elite quarterback, or if the previous trends will continue in 2021 was an anomaly.
Well, what's interesting is that with elite, that last year we saw all the quarterbacks move up 2 to 3 rounds. And that could be the answer we're looking for, because when, you made a very good point in your article. Why don't you talk about the effect of running quarterbacks and how the field has adjusted?
Yeah, certainly. As while we do see these quarterbacks such as Mahomes or Allen or Lamar who really do have ceilings to separate from the rest of the quarterback position, so they should be valued more. But now we're also seeing the field actually adjust. They are drafting the quarterbacks earlier than before. So now, while they are better, they're also more expensive. And so we've seen the field actually properly value these elite quarterbacks now. So it doesn't seem to be as much of an advantage as maybe it was early in the offseason last year.
Talk about, we had 2 years where a late round quarterback that was young, and funny, each one of them had sat on the bench a year. Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. Those guys really were being drafted at the end of the window or after the window. Uh, Talk about how those 2 years either did or didn't change the dynamic.
No, I think it's interesting, especially when you analyze it in the context of 2021, where we had rookie quarterbacks who people were really excited about in Trey Lance and Justin Fields, but then they flop. I think that people had visions of, or they envisioned Lamar Jackson when they were drafting Fields and Lance, with his second year breakout. So I think it's interesting now. Now we're seeing people have a bitter taste in their mouth with coming off the Lance and Fields year. So we might actually see these rookie quarterbacks going later than before. When, say, last year people were maybe a little bit too aspirational with Lance and Fields. Now people might be underappreciating the value of these rookie quarterbacks, and you might want to zig when other people are zagging and start to get back on these rookie quarterbacks while their values are down.
Yeah, and I would say that the reason I faded Fields and Lance last year was because similar to the conversation we had about dead zone running backs, that their ADP was including as if they were going to be the starter from day one. And in these tournaments, when the comment that I got from people was, well, those are tournament winners, and they could be, right. I don't want to minimize that they could be, right. But the fact is, if you're taking only two quarterbacks and one of them is a guy who might not play for half a year, and in Lance's situation, they had come out and said, Jimmy's our guy, he's going to play this year. The other team had said, Dalton's our guy, he's going to play this year. Now, it could have changed, but then we've also seen how rookie quarterbacks can struggle. And so my point is, if you have a 13-week season and a guy misses 3 or 4 weeks, you might not have a shot to get to that tournament. So if I was going to, when I did take those guys last year, it was part of 3 quarterback builds. And now I know that I should have made those 3 quarterback builds within the window.
Right. And I think that's an interesting point, is in that when the general consensus on a player is that they are the quote unquote tournament players, I wonder if, that means that they're probably being drafted closer to their ceiling than closer to their median range of outcomes. And that might be a player that is just too expensive. And what Ben Gretsch talks about a lot is, I think he uses the phrase, you want to draft players with small misses, big hits. And so you don't want to be drafting a player at their ceiling. You want to be drafting them closer to the floor so that you can actually get value on their upside rather than need their upside.
I agree. And I would say that something we should talk about, both in regards to, well, let's stick with quarterback a little bit further, and let's look at the utilization. What's your biggest takeaway from the utilization?
I think it's that elite quarterback has become a lot more popular. And I think that obviously makes sense because, when you're talking about elite quarterback historically, you've only had maybe 1, 2, maximum 3 quarterbacks in a given year that would even be considered within the first 5 rounds of ADP. So now as you get more quarterbacks that have that ceiling, of course, they're going to go earlier and you're going to have more teams drafting elite quarterbacks. But I think it's interesting because then that takes away from the field utilization of quarterbacks in the window. So you now have more teams drafting quarterbacks really early. And I think that really with quarterback, the way I like to draft is I kind of have 3 rules when I draft quarterbacks. It's either 1, you draft them in the window in rounds 6 through 12, or you draft a quarterback when you feel like the other positional tiers are flat, or 3, you feel like you're getting a value on that quarterback. And ultimately, we need to be really ADP sensitive with our quarterbacks, because when you draft them too early, then you're missing out on all of the great running backs or tight ends or receivers that are going early for a position that historically does not have spike week performances. And of course, we now have some elite quarterbacks that do have that spike week ability, but then that means that you're foregoing a player with spike weeks at another position.
I was wondering if you could maybe do me a favor for the next time we go. One of my big premises last year, and I had a very good pass-through rate last year, one of my big premises was that the fact that every quarterback, I did a chart. and every single quarterback was going 2 to 3 rounds earlier than they had the year before, except for the top two guys. So my takeaway was, well, that makes the top two guys more valuable, right? Because the difference between the top two guys and, quote, the field or that next tier was less. I was wondering if you could, for our next show, just look at it and move that window instead of what's it normally, 6 to 11?
6 to 12, yeah.
6 to 12. Make it 4 to 10 and see how that changes. I bet you you'll end up seeing the numbers go back to, I think that's the answer as to why the numbers changed dramatically last year.
Yeah, and I think especially when you had these hard cutoffs, say rounds 5 or 6, round 5 being an elite quarterback in this definition, round 6 being in the window. Well, we have some quarterbacks that are being drafted right around that 5-6 turn. So what if they were being drafted a little bit earlier or later? I think that kind of gets into the point of having some feel for your draft. Can I draft this quarterback in round 5? Sure, he might be considered an elite quarterback. Well, will I be getting a position of equal value in round 6 than I would in round 5? Then yeah, maybe I'll break the rule a little bit and take the quarterback early if I'm going to get the same value at the other position the following round. So I think that's important to keep in mind your tiers and when positions are flat versus when they're going to fall off.
All right. So with that in mind, when I say to you, and I know you don't have time to research it in the middle of the show, when I say to you the window, instead of doing it by round, what if we did it by the quarterback drafted, right? If we called elite the first 3 quarterbacks drafted, and we considered 4 to 15 as the window or something like that. Do you think that's an interesting way to kind of look at it going forward? Because one of the things that I've always done is I've always drafted the quarterback like a few years ago. Remember when Russell Wilson played injured all year? And you could get him at, in round 8 or 9, where he was going round 5 or 6 the year before. That's typically the guy, like Tom Brady was late last year because he's considered old, right? And he doesn't run. Stafford, the same thing. That's, to me, because I've studied the individual player win rates, that's when you tend to find the best winning rates for quarterbacks is that, Josh Allen, the year he crushed, was that guy in round 8 or 9. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it kind of goes back to the idea that you don't want to draft a player at their ceiling. You want to draft them at a range where if they have a ceiling, you actually get value on that, not where you need the ceiling. And those quarterbacks are typically quarterbacks, say 5 through 10. They're typically being drafted at a range that's actually their median outcome. So if they do hit a ceiling, you actually get value on that. Unlike, say, someone like if Mahomes is going in the top 36 overall, well, you kind of need him to be amazing to even pay off that 3rd round ADP. So I think that it tends to be when you target probably that second tier of quarterbacks, it's actually a range where they're being priced more on their floor side than on their ceiling side.
Yeah, I think what would be fascinating would be a study where you kind of took and added the the quarterback drafted, right? So if you took one, what was their win rate when they were taken with running back 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way down to say 20, right? What was their win rate when the second quarterback was the 8th, 9th, and 10th or you might want to do it like instead of 1, you might want to do it is what's the win rate if the number 1 guy was taken with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, make him like windows of 2 or 3. I think that would be fascinating and might open up some things.
Yeah, certainly as, we have this resurgence of the elite quarterback. I think it's a really important topic to dive into, and you can't necessarily look at the win rates of, from years 2017 to 2020. So I think this is kind of a fascinating time to evaluate the top end of the quarterback position.
Yeah, because it was a point I made to Sean and Calm on a podcast once. I had asked them a question. Not my strength, Billy, or Bradley, or Billy, or Bradley, or Billy. I can just pray that a guy like Michael does it for me. All right, so let's hit on one last topic before we go, and that is the effect of going from 18 rounds to 20 rounds. And what do you see that effect having on both the running back and the quarterback position?
I think my take might be a little bit different from other people, and actually it doesn't really impact me that much because most of my volume actually comes in the two formats that had 20 rounds last year in Drafters and DraftKings. But for the people that are transitioning from 18 rounds to 20 rounds in formats that don't have a defense, I think it doesn't actually change as much as people think it does. I think that the players drafted in rounds 19 and 20 have such a low expectation for fantasy production at that point that they really shouldn't move the needle that much in your macro strategy. But I do think it shows how important it is to now consider roster construction based off rounds rather than just positional limits. Like, you don't just anymore say you're drafting 2 or 3 quarterbacks, but you're saying which rounds you're drafting them by. I think it's much more important to now be specific with the rounds that you're considering players. But I ultimately end up using the 19th and 20th rounds. I still used my roster constructions as if it was 18 rounds, but then I used the last 2 picks to either draft a player that's a falling value that I think can actually contribute starting weeks. I'll do some type of correlation such as stacking or playoff opponent. And then also I round out positional groups that might otherwise be a little bit more fragile in an 18 round draft, such as instead of hyperfragile just being stopping at 4 running backs now, maybe I'll add a 5th one super late in rounds 19 to 20. So hyperfragile is no longer 4 early and stopping. It's now 4 early and then 1 super late.
Yep. I think you kind of hit on my overall strategy with them. And I think it's going to change 2 different things. One, I think you're going to see a lot less really bad roster constructions because the extra position will give you some plausible deniability. Where guys will say, "Oh, I only have 2 tight ends. Let me take a third," even though their 2 tight ends didn't include one of the top 5 guys. They only had 2. Well, now they'll take 3, and they'll say, "Well." So you can't just look at it and say, "Man, that's a bad mistake." But what I do think will also happen is that guys like us who've really put in the work, it's going to lower our injury variance, right? I think it actually, even though it might seem like it's going to make the roster construction more even, I think that if you do everything right, it's going to make you less fragile to injuries because there's nothing worse than having a great team and then you get to week 17 and you've only got 1 running back who's healthy left. You drafted the 5 that you should. Having that 6th guy, I do think that it lowers the injury variance, which is going to be to the advantage of the people who put in the work. Your thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I think that understanding which types of players you should be drafting rounds 19 and 20 are also interesting. Are you going to be drafting the players that might have a little bit more of a defined role early, but they don't have a ceiling? Or are you going to be drafting the players that are probably going to score 0 points during the entire year, but if they do hit, they're going to hit big and contribute spike weeks? So I think that's another thing to consider in rounds 19 to 20. And I think you made a really good point also about people, best ball managers, being able to hide poor roster construction more. I think that's really interesting because now, say a roster construction that would typically be bad and very fragile, well, they can now just tack on 2 potentially meaningless players at the end of their roster, but kind of hide it and say that, well, I was able to cover it up in rounds 19 to 20, but in reality, it's still very fragile. So I think that was a good point.
All right. Billy has a question, and I'm now convinced it is Billy. Tell that to my 12,500 winning Pringle team. Billy made it to the same final 12 that I did and finished ahead of me. We had a lot of teams together, and we each made one separately, and his finished ahead of mine, which I will never live down. Wouldn't the math suggest more positional players equals more opportunities for boom weeks?
No, I think it ultimately comes down to what type of archetype of a player are you drafting in the final few rounds. Are you drafting the player that probably has a role, or are you drafting the player that's gonna have 0 points, but then if he finds the opportunity, he's gonna spike. So I think it really just comes down to those last few rounds have such a low expectation. But what types of players or archetypes are you filling that role with?
Yeah, and I think that I think I mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. I think that especially in tournaments, people fall in love with dart throws, and I'm not against dart throws. I think every roster should have one, maybe two. But I'm more and more becoming interested in players, that third running back who's going to be on the field every week, right? The chances of him being someone who's going to win you the championship become less, but he's the guy who can help you to be more profitable, to advance. And I think people underestimate floor rate as it relates to your ability to be profitable in these tournaments, because the more teams you get going into the playoffs, the more money you get back. And sure, it would be great to stick a first place team, but I think you also want to be wary of just making a lot of bad teams and saying, and I get this a lot on Twitter when I pick on someone's roster. They'll say, well, this has a lot, it's a tournament. This is a risky team. And one of my new sayings is there's a difference between fragile and precarious.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think when people are drafting in tournaments, people are now taking it to the too far extreme, and they're just using it as an excuse to, there's that saying, draft as if you're right. Well, I think that's true to a certain degree, but also you don't want to take it too far and then start to make your teams so fragile. Ben Gretch has made a really good point in that in best ball, you don't actually need all of your players on your roster to hit at once. And so I think that's a good point to keep in mind. And you don't want to get too fragile with some of these rosters as well.
Yep. It's okay to be fragile. You don't want to be precarious. I think that's going to do it. We'll see you. We'll let everyone know on Twitter when we're going to finish this. Michael, fabulous work. So glad that you were able to come on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to finish it out with talking about tight ends next time I'm on.
And wide receivers.
And wide receivers, of course.
All right,
Our
guys.
favorite
We're going to
position.
see. We'll see you later.